Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. It's been a long time since my last video because I've had to move equipment and move places. So this video is going to be very low tech, but what can you do? I wanted to make another one. And so I wanted to talk about is China a technology superpower? Because it's something that's been in the news a lot, the kind of tech war between China and the US. And I've been reading this book called AI Superpowers by a guy called Kwai Fu Lee. And it's actually quite good, at least it's well written. And the basic argument of the book is that China will dominate the rest of the world when it comes to technology, or specifically AI technology. And there's a lot of very interesting information, and it goes through the birth of the Chinese tech scene. But I think the basic thesis is wrong, and I want to explain why. And so the main idea is that China will become the world's leading AI superpower for three reasons. The first is that China has more people than anywhere else in the world, and therefore it has more customers and can provide more data, and therefore develop better AI. The second is that China's political system means that it does not have data privacy laws, and the government has no qualms about using this data. It can use the system more efficiently than other countries, is the idea. And the third is that because of China's sort of developing country, cutthroat capitalist system, it's just more, competitive. And you have to be tough to survive, and therefore it's a more competitive system than the US or Europe. And the book, especially at the beginning, it has a lot of very interesting details. There's quite a nice story about how when the first Italian Jesuits come to China as missionaries in the 17th century, and they bring these very expensive and ornate clocks to show the Chinese, they're sort of summoned to the emperor's court, and just a few decades later, when new Jesuits return to China, they go to Canton and find lots of very similar European looking clocks. They're actually all made by local Chinese people because they'd copied all of these clocks so diligently that after a few decades it was almost impossible to tell the difference. And so this is meant to be the analogy for the Chinese tech sector, that Americans and Europeans invented most of the AI internet tech, but China's been so diligent at copying and learning all this tech that now it will soon overtake them. At least that's the idea. But I think there's a few problems with this whole thesis. Because the first argument is that China has more people and therefore more customers. I mean, like other countries also use US tech companies like Facebook, WhatsApp. You just have to include India, and already you have many more customers than China if you include India and America. This doesn't really stand up to any scrutiny. I mean, you just look at the numbers of the users of Facebook compared to WeChat. I mean, Facebook has like 2 billion users compared to WeChat, which has like 500 million. And it's the same if you compare Google to Baidu or IQI to Netflix. Like, they're just not comparable. And it's like a very basic refutation of this argument. It just seems silly. Like, I can't really find anywhere in the book that actually addresses like what it seems like a very basic point. Secondly, I don't think the idea that not having privacy laws means that they can develop better apps or better AI. Because again, I mean, like one of the biggest criticisms of tech companies, especially in the US, is that there aren't really many good data protection laws. The only place that really has strict data protection is Europe, and even then, it's only under specific circumstances. What they basically try and do is stop companies selling your data onto other companies, but Google and Facebook can still use their data to do whatever, to track whatever they want with you. Just they're not allowed to sell it in Europe. They're just not allowed to sell it on to other companies. And finally, the point about China just being innately more competitive because there's a lot of people and it's very cutthroat capitalist. We could say that about any developing country. We could say that about India. Say that about Indonesia. Because it's a harder lifestyle. That doesn't seem to make them like develop better companies. The author in the book, he includes an anecdote about the founder of Tencent. So Tencent owns QQ and WeChat and a lot of these big apps in China. And when they were starting out, a competitor sort of started a bidding war with Tencent, and basically he used his corrupt contacts in the police to try and get the head of Tencent arrested. And so the police raided their offices, and they were forced to relocate to Hong Kong to hide out there. And this is like presented as a story to just show the like great competitive spirit of the Chinese tech sector. And can you imagine if it was like Bill Gates in the 90s had like used corrupt connections to try and get like Steve Jobs arrested and have all his offices shut down? Would that be an example of just the competitive spirit of the US? Like, I don't think it would somehow. I think it would be an example of a legal system not functioning very well. And actually, like around the time the book came out, which was 2018, that's almost the exact same time where Jack Ma, who's the founder of Alibaba, which owns Taobao, it's like Chinese Amazon, he was basically forced to step down by the Chinese government because it had become too powerful. The company controlled a lot of the financial interests. And I've got a funny story about this because when this happened, I was in China and I'd heard that Jack Ma had just been told to step down by the government. I was staying at a university at the time. And so I met up with some people, some Chinese students at the university who I occasionally met with and spoke to. And I asked them sort of like, I've heard Jack Ma stepping down because of government pressure. And they were all like, no, 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 he's just retiring. He's just old. He just wants to live a quiet life now. It's nothing. There's no like pressure on him. And then at that same meeting, there's a guy whose brother worked for the government, and I asked him the same question, and immediately he was like, "Oh yeah, the government asked him to step down," like straight off the bat. It's sort of like Trump saying to Jeff Bezos, like, "Amazon's become too powerful. You're gonna have to step down as CEO, and I'm gonna install like Mike Pompeo as Amazon CEO." It's like the equivalent of that happening. And so as the book went on, originally I sort of thought it was interesting, but not sure I agree with everything. And then later, and there were more and more instances that the author gives where it seems like it's just kind of being disingenuous. So he states, for example, that Google left China in 2010 because it couldn't compete with Baidu or with Chinese companies, when in reality it left because it was cyber attacked by the Chinese government and then completely banned a few years later. He also states that Didi, the Chinese taxi company, outcompeted Uber in 2016, when in reality Uber was allowed into China for a short time until the government could steal its technology, and then the government put a lot of money into Didi and banned Uber. And so the fact is that the Chinese tech model is to allow Western companies in enough to copy them, and then to ban them and develop their own versions of all of these technologies. And so you might say, well, yes, that's innovative because they have the capability to develop this stuff. But North Korea has its own tech services. North Korea has its own operating system, its own brand of phones. It even now has its own Netflix-style streaming service. But that doesn't mean they're a technology superpower comparable to the US. I mean, because it's purely based on keeping out competition. And I think the test of that is that if you look at outside of China, the only, let's say, successful apps or successful technology applications are Zoom and TikTok. TikTok's just a bit like a fad, like Vine. Zoom isn't particularly great. So there's these sort of isolated examples, but apart from that, like most Chinese apps are just not very good. They're full of like really annoying ads and badly designed interfaces. And that's why, given the choice, very few people outside of China actually use them. Now, none of this is to say that China doesn't innovate, because there's plenty of aspects in which China today does innovate. And so, if you go back to the Song Dynasty, which is around 11th century China, that's when China was sort of like at its golden age, at least technologically. That's when you have the four great inventions of ancient China. So you had paper, gunpowder, the printing press, and the compass. Compass was interestingly invented as part of their Taoist religion to do with feng shui. So they believed that wind and magnetic energy and gravity are all part of the same force of the universe, and the compass was a way to find these magic places. And there's plenty of other things that they had in the Song Dynasty, but when you compare it to the Industrial Revolution, you've sort of got a few medieval inventions which are impressive for their time, but they don't really compare with the Industrial Revolution. And today, the CCP tries to use these past inventions as part of their propaganda to show how innovative China is, and says today there's the new four inventions, which are high speed trains, 5G, e commerce, and shared bikes. And now, of course, all of these are not actually inventions by China. High speed trains were invented in Japan. 5G was invented by Qualcomm, an American company. E commerce, a lot Western companies had that capability for a long time, and so did shared bikes. Well, the innovation, if you like, that China did was to implement these things on a very large scale. So no one has as many high speed rails. No other country has as big an e-commerce network or as big a shared bikes company. But of course, China has an incredibly large amount of people. And so again, Huawei's entire business model was to steal 5G technology and receive a lot of government funding and then offer it back to companies at a cheaper price. And so there's no doubt that China today is very innovative when it comes to copying. They have enormous engineering capacity. I mean, just look at their infrastructure, their highways, things like that. And you can pick out a few areas where China really does innovate. It sort of invents things. And so one area they're definitely able to innovate is when it comes to producing things at a cheaper capacity. I mean, part of that is because companies like Apple have an interest in keeping the price of an iPhone at a certain price, and in China, where copyright law is kind of bad, they have to lower prices to be competitive. Obviously, e-commerce things like Alipay and WeChat, they're actually very advanced. They work very well. But again, that's an example. They only have that because it never had the credit card infrastructure to begin with, so they sort of skipped straight to e-commerce. There are some specific innovations which are genuine. So probably the best example is the Mischievous Satellite, which is the first ever quantum satellite. And so it's a satellite that uses quantum computing to communicate, allegedly as a kind of unhackable network to provide communication around bases in China. You might argue, how practical that really is, because the computers on the ground in China are hackable. It's not like there's people sitting on a quantum laptop, in Beijing who are reading messages, but it's still innovative. And so, because of the stuff like this quantum satellite that they've got, it looks like that's part of the sort of tech war between the US and China. There's a race going on around quantum computing. China had the world's most powerful supercomputer in 2015, and then it was overtaken a few years ago in 2018 by the US. And so, obviously, because of China's size, it has immense resources that it can put into this. And so, it's a little bit similar to like in the 50s when Russia was the Soviet Union was the first government to launch a satellite into space, Sputnik. And so, the Misha satellite might be a kind of Sputnik moment where other countries go like, "Wow, we need to pay attention to this." And you do have other AI innovations. So you have this idea of a smart cities. So Alibaba have an AI which regulates the flow of traffic in different cities to try and manage traffic lights more efficiently, which is it's interesting. But the places where China is really ahead, facial recognition technology and speech recognition, and I think it's fairly obvious why that is. The government's poured massive amounts of resources in developing authoritarian tech like facial recognition, which no other country can match. But again, this isn't like a product that people want to buy. The only market for it is other authoritarian governments. And this is all driven by AI. So in Xinjiang, for example, the Uyghur population are sentenced to labor camps, basically on the command of an algorithm, not the police. So there's actually a data center called IJOC, the Intelligent Joint Operations Platform, which is a massive supercomputer which actually has an algorithm which determines who gets sent to a camp. decide, for example, if they've watched too many international videos, if they've watched something which expresses weaker nationalism in some way, or if they've communicated um, some kind of anti-party thought to a friend. And if they're lucky, they'll just have to study Xi Jinping thought, and if they're unlucky, they'll be in a labor camp where they can be, tortured and killed. So there's literally an algorithm that decides all that. It's like, imagine if you had a Facebook or Google algorithm, instead of recommending videos or products, it's acting as a judge, jury, and executioner for millions of people. That's what's happening right now in Xinjiang. I actually have another story about my own experiences with Chinese tech. Um, when I was working as an English teacher, you have to go to the immigration office, to the immigration bureau, and the local one we went there, and then everywhere there's these robots that have these screens on them that you can select, which department you need, and select which forms you need. The robots sort of move around, and you sort of think like, wow, this is really cool. It's so amazing almost. But then a few weeks later we'd have to go back to the immigration bureau, and like half the robots were like out of order. I actually have a photo of a robot that's been decommissioned, has an out of order sign on it. Yeah, there it is. And you realize these robots, they're kind of just glorified like screens that move around and say things. And then we went back to the bureau a few weeks after that, and all of the robots were gone. They'd been completely taken away. A lot of the showcases of tech in China are basically for show. You have things like these surveillance birds. This is a real photo of a surveillance drone disguised as a bird. That's a real thing. If you should make it clear that it's not a normal country you're dealing with when they have surveillance birds. Um, and you have all these like kind of crazy projects like that. Like you had these head bracelets in a school which would monitor the brain waves of children to see if they were concentrating or not, and then teachers would be able to like punish them if their brain waves show they weren't paying enough attention. And over the last few years, the Chinese government has tried to get many more people to go into tech. They had this kind of innovation campaign. It's, AI has been included in 2015 as part of their 5-year plan to make China one of the world leaders in AI. And so now they graduate millions of students in AI. And as part of this campaign, they sort of showed all of these, pictures of like, look at this Chinese farmer. He built a tractor out of spare parts, and like, look, this local worker put wheels on a suitcase to show like the innovative spirit of the Chinese people. And it's sort of like the Great Leap Forward when you had like the party and Mao being like, look, the people are spontaneously forming workers' communes. They're organizing into the radical proletariat. And so it's like they still have this whole idea of like invigorating the masses to achieve something. And like really, like Chinese people are naturally quite intelligent and hardworking, and they have an education system which does put a lot of value on technical education, and so a lot of them are very competent. But sadly, they have a legal system which is so corrupt and so wasteful, and a bureaucratic structure which is incredibly rigid. And that means that it's very, very hard for actual innovative people to rise to the top, and for projects to get off the ground if they don't have specific government funding or government connections. And so, more than anything, it's quite sad that the legacy of this top-down approach to innovation, the best that it's produced, is to become a world leader in authoritarian tech, and arguably, despite all these technological achievements, the net contribution is to make people's lives much worse.